Donc ça, c'est bon. Merci beaucoup. En tout cas, thank you. Juste une petite introduction en français. Après, on va passer en anglais parce qu'on a deux intervenants qui parlent anglais. Donc, voilà, on va se mettre dans la langue universelle. Donc, le FIR est ravi d'accueillir nos intervenants aujourd'hui pour parler de la situation au Mozambique et illustré par le cas de TotalEnergie au Mozambique, donc illustrer la responsabilité des entreprises dans une situation de zone de conflit. Merci à tous d'être là, d'être ici. I will switch to English. Just to tell you that we will have around 40 minutes of presentation for all our speakers. So we have the three speakers here to speak about the situation, and we will have two speakers on Teams. We are really pleased to welcome our speakers, several experts today to speak about the situation in Mozambique and to come back on the situation of 2021, when several killings have been committed in the area where the project of TotalEnergie is implemented, Mozambique LNG. So to speak about this tricky topic, we are pleased to welcome today Antoine Bouhey, which is the campaign coordinator at Regan Finance, and Daniel de Lemos Ribeiro, who is a technical coordinator from Justiça Ambiental. They will give us some detail about the context of the project of TotalEnergie and the context of Mozambique globally. Alex Perry, who is an independent investigation journalist, who has published its investigation on the media Politico at the end of September, and he will explain us his work and all the detail of his work. We have also Clémence Becta. I don't know if she is online or not, not for the moment. I think she will arrive. So she is lawyer and the coordinator of Justicial Action Group at FIDH. Hello, Clémence. You could hear us clearly?
Yes, very well. Hello.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So she will speak more about legal and criminal responsibility for French companies and how that could be how they could be implied. And we have Kitty Mirella Fumo. I don't know if she is online also. Yes, she seems so. So thank you very much to be there. Katie is a gas campaign coordinator of Justiça Ambiental, and she will speak about local community aspects and impact of the project, more globally of gas project, I think. So thank you really much to be there, and I will speak. I will let the floor to Antoine to speak about the context. And so, do not hesitate, of course, to speak to ask your question at the end of the session. You can write the question, and we will speak about it more at the end of the session. Yeah. Could you see us online? People who are online, could you just tell us if you see us? Est-ce que vous pouvez nous voir? Yeah, ouais, c'est bon. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Je vais aussi parler en anglais pour que Daniel et Alex puissent voir de quoi je parle. So I'm going to just give a brief overview of the main dates and numbers related to the project as an introduction. So the project is one of the biggest investments in Africa. It originated when at the beginning of the years 2010 there were massive gas discoveries in the basin in the basin of Mozambique, which represents the 9th biggest well of gas in the world. There were acquisitions in 2 blocks. So one block where the main operators are ExxonMobil and Eni, working as joint operators of several projects, and in block number 1, TotalEnergie acquired its current capacity, which developed into the Mozambique LNG project. So the sole capacity of the resources that Total has acquired would represent 3.3 to 4.5 billion tons of CO2 if they were emitted, which represents roughly the annual emissions of the European Union if they are emitted. To get the project running, of course, it was, as I said, one of the biggest investments in Africa. Total obtained, after acquiring the project in 2019, loans agreements from 31 financial institutions, so 15 private banks and 16 public institutions, representing $15.4 billion. These were signed in 2020. However, there were important risks, massive risks, because the project is developed in a conflict area. So risk related to human rights, of course, to environmental impacts, to impacts on biodiversity, and economic impacts. And as the project was developed in a risky area and a conflict zone, there were also risks related to the local insurgency, which resulted a year after the signing of the loan agreements in a massive attack in March 2021, where, as Alex will be explaining after, the attacks resulted in stopping the project because of massive killings that resulted in more than 1,200 people being killed on the days of those attacks. Since then, the project has been suspended by TotalEnergie, invoking the force majeure clause, and several articles, such as the ones published by Alex Perry, and litigations were launched related to the project and the responsibility of Total. In terms of responsibility, as we will discuss it, a year ago, a report commissioned by TotalEnergie and written by Jean-Christophe Ruffin stressed that because Total is financing directly a joint task force that is tasked with protecting the project, the company could be held responsible and considered responsible for the impacts and for the human rights violations and killings that are committed by the Mozambican army in the area. Hence, the presentations will go a bit deeper in those elements. Today, the project is still suspended, even though operations are ongoing and Total is developing the project, but the financing of the project is still suspending and pending the approval by the 31 financiers individually to accept the lifting of the force majeure by TotalEnergie. So that's the main context in which the project is unraveling. Over to you, Danny.
So we have the overview. So a few things I think there's 3 things I think is important to acknowledge. One of the biggest investments in Africa, so in Mozambique, being one of the poorest countries, this investment has a huge role in influencing the way our government acts and the political landscape of our country. So you see a shift towards being very aggressive towards civil society or journalists that highlight problems or are critical of the project. And you see a focus towards protecting this project. And also you see the usual, these investments are amplifiers. You put a resource into a system, it amplifies existing tendencies. So it's important to understand the underlying reality in Mozambique, which is there's a lot of oppression and shrinking civil society spaces. There is huge issues of corruption, and there's also a lot of strong social economic stresses already existing on the ground. So what happens is the minute these contracts are signed, Mozambique gets access using the collateral on the projected revenues of the projects and goes on and takes out a few illegal loans. They're illegal because they weren't approved by Parliament. When these loans are discovered in 2016, there's a huge economic collapse, and our GDP debt our debt prior to this was around 40 to 50% of our GDP. It goes to 120 to 140% of our GDP. So these causes even further pushes these social economic stresses. On top of that, Mozambique also is a country highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate. So you're having increased cyclones and flooding, which is further putting all these stresses. So why is this important? Well, this has caused, so you have a situation where you have an oppressive government shutting down a lot of voices, and you have the communities that are affected by the project. So there's in the north, it's very important to understand that we're talking about more than 80% of the population is subsistence-based fisher folks or farmers. So the connection to the land and access to these resources are critical for the livelihoods of people. So any project that takes away land, takes away access, or any of these factors is eliminating people's livelihoods. So this project had straight away, in a complex situation, you have a situation where you have a lot of fisher folks getting moved out from the coastline inland and losing the ability to fish. You have a lot of communities losing access to land and being moved away from their areas without actually having equivalent land, arable land. And this has caused a huge loss of livelihoods. Kat will go more detail on the current situation of that. But on top of that, all these stresses caused, in the north, you had in 2017 the current of insurgents. And this insurgents, even though everybody focuses on the extremist aspect, we also have to go deeper than that, because East Africa has always had a lot of extremist narratives, be it tribal, be it religious. It's never had traction in that part of Mozambique until recently, and it's had traction because of the socioeconomic drivers. So when you marginalize the youth, when you take away people's lands and livelihoods, when you, all these factors have created a group of very marginalized, angry youth that can be pushed into these spaces. And I say that now because also what's happening right now to Mozambique is quite important, because we've had a month of protests due to the elections. We had on the 9th of October elections. There were a lot of irregularities and a lot of problems around the elections. And the lawyer that was developing the case to highlight the fraud around the elections was assassinated. 25 bullets on the 19th. And the opposition party also, a lot of the opposition party got together and started mobilized the community to protest. The fact is, a lot of the government has been the same government since independence. We have over 50 years of the rule with 2/3 majority, and so complete control of government, and people are tired. So this was a protest vote. And this is really important that we keep these constructive pathways. The youth has to use their energy in constructive ways, such as vote to show their discontent. If they lose trust and hope in these processes, it's going to further push more people into these more violent and non-constructive pathways. So right now, Mozambique is very volatile, and the project has been central to the militarization, because given the situation, the government had to militarize the project area. And this militarization meant that Mozambique suddenly started getting a lot of funding. Just from the EU, there were $80 million to the Mozambican troops, $15 million euros, to the SADC troop, which is regional, and then another $20 million approved this week to Rwanda. We have a foreign wandering troops also. They're all protecting the project. And how do we know this? Alex will go into the specifics, but one of the biggest terrorist attacks happened in Mozambique in 2021 March. And when that attack happened, over 800 security forces were protecting the project area, and around 30 to 40 were protecting the civilians. So you can see why the military there, for who they are there, and where the numbers and who they're protecting. The problem with this militarization was it was done in a very unprofessional way. So as the military came in, you had bad training. Mozambique didn't have the logistics to deal with all of this. So what happens is you had delays in salaries, shortages of food, and the military just had lack of supervision. So you had this wave of rapes, kidnapping, and violence toward the population. And so, and these are troops that were there to protect the project and getting paid by Total. So there's a huge liability issue. So we're having this scenario in which we have, we need to understand the links between the project and all these problems. But on top of that, if you had to see like what are the things that could go wrong in a project, it's like, okay, it's one of the biggest marine reserve. It's a UN biosphere of global importance. It has a huge amount of rare, endangered, endemic species. It has a huge, there's a whole bunch of waves of human rights issues, which we'll go into. It has, but usually people say Mozambique needs economic development. But the reality is, when one looks at that, there's only one independent economic assessment to the project, which is by West et al. The model is available to the model, and you can change the values that you think, but that model is available if anyone wants to run the simulations with other values. But what that shows is the economics of the project aren't very great either. We're going to be going into a huge surplus of gas production. A lot of projects will go in pipeline in 2026, 27. The Ukraine bubble is going away, so the prices are no longer what they were. And it's putting, and a lot of these risks of stranded assets and these risks that are coming up are getting transferred to the country, which is going to further increase social instability. Right now, Mozambique will start expecting to receive revenues from this only 2040 if the gas starts getting exported in 2026, 27. Which means you're going to have the biggest investment in Africa and hardly any revenues coming into Mozambique for over a decade. That's going to further push the social instability. So those are factors of risk that have to be taken into account. And already in a country that is vulnerable to climate change and has no fossil fuel sector, our GDP has no dependency on fossil fuel. Our labor sector does not have any dependency. We're going to start a country on a fossil fuel path. In this time, we're talking about transition. So in long term, looking in terms of this decision, in terms of just the general climate, is also a very irresponsible decision for the general climate. It's a huge carbon bomb that we're going to be starting. And right now we're in force majeure, and we haven't built anything yet. So we have a chance to really reassess, look at the risk again. And unfortunately, Total has really invested a lot of money. So they like it's like a person that is a casino that's lost already and is hoping that the next dice will win. And we need to look at the situation right now. Forget about what has been invested. Right now is a good decision. A lot of investors say that if this decision was to be made now, they wouldn't have gone forward. But technically, we should be doing the decision in that way. What is the reality now, and what are the liabilities and risks now, and reassess. Thanks.
Here we go. So I should make clear from the start that I'm not an activist, I'm a journalist. I have to say that. I mean, it's fairly obvious that I'm a journalist because I am. But because there aren't that many journalists that go to northern Mozambique, and because I've spent 4 years investigating what's gone on there, I'm constantly accused of actually being an activist. It's just, it's quite a story. That's why I'm on it. But that's what I'll explain to you. I mean, to pick up on the timeline from the beginning, gas is discovered in 2010. In 2017, there's an insurgency that starts, and initially it's local. It's about government corruption and about marginalization, about poverty, essentially. So the whole irony of everything we're discussing is the discovery, this enormous amount of gas actually has the potential to solve this problem. If it's shared around, it would kill the revolution, basically. In 2019, Total buys in. That's also the year of the first fatal attack on the project, when a driver coming out of the concession is pulled from his car and dismembered. And that becomes a kind of theme of the violence here. It's spectacularly barbaric. The leader of, or the erstwhile leader of the rebellion, had a real thing for beheading and swords. So in 2019, he's becoming notorious enough, and his group is becoming notorious enough that it officially affiliates with ISIS. In 2020, there's another much more serious attack on the traffic going in and out of Fungi, the project. 9 people are killed, most of them dismembered and beheaded. There are other sporadic attacks on the traffic. Nothing's hit the concession as yet, but there's a lot on the traffic. And through this, and the insurgency is very much in the ascendancy. In 2020, ExxonMobil is so concerned about the security that it pulls out. So Total is there alone. And that should have been a signal. If ExxonMobil is pulling out, Total stays, and the insurgency is gradually encircling essentially the project and the town of Palma, which is nearby. There is a first attack at the very end of 2020 in December. Total at that point abandons the project, flies everybody out, all the contractors that work for it, who are living in town, not inside the fence, essentially left to fend for themselves and phone friends with speedboats to come and pick them up. I think about a dozen people are killed then. But that's a sort of first feeling out attack. What then happens 3 months later is a full attack, well planned and coordinated, from the north, from the south, from the east, essentially from 3 sides. And as Danny said, because the security, the army and the police are essentially defending the project, the town is more or less undefended. There are a few dozen people there, but that's where the population is. And they lay waste. And there's no one to push them out, to fight them. Really, there are a few sort of neighborhood militia groups that have a go, but essentially Al-Shabaab is in town for about a month, if not more, and never really leaves until late May or June, so a couple of months. No one ever counts how many people were killed. And so eventually, when the population came back, this was something that I needed to know as a journalist. And so I set up a survey group who went house to house. Eventually, they went to 13,686. It took 5 months, and I employed 9 people to do this. But the eventual figures were 1,352 dead, another 209 abducted. Of those, 330 were beheaded. Men were disproportionately targeted, so were people wearing uniforms from Total's site. Age was no savior. We had a baby of 2 months that was dismembered. We had a great-grandmother of 105. But to put that in context, and these comparisons are pretty grim, but 1,353 is the second biggest terror attack of all time after 9/11. Beats anything that happened in Iraq or Syria. That is not acknowledged by either the Mozambican authorities or Total. To this day, Total maintains that no one died. In fact, 54 of its own workers were killed. They essentially say there is no official toll. No, there is no official toll, because if you're the local authorities, the official toll is going to be embarrassing. If you're Total, the official toll is going to be embarrassing and have all sorts of implications to do with compensation and so on. At the end of that process of the survey, one of my surveyors phoned me and said, he'd heard about another massacre, much smaller, but very different. And I eventually interviewed 13 people who survived it. 3 months after the first massacre on Palma, there are still people living in the villages south of Palma. The entire population of Palma had fled. But in the villages, they're still there. And if there's any sound of battle or gunfire coming, they run to the farms and hide, or hide in the bush. And they don't want to leave their farms, essentially. They get text messages saying, from the army, saying that there's going to be an assault, and if they want to seek sanctuary, they should go and see the army, which is based just outside Total's base at Afungi. So about 500 people walk north, men, women, and children. It takes them about a day to get there. When they arrive, it's immediately apparent that civilian safety is not the purpose of this mission. The women and the men are separated. The women are systematically sexually assaulted. I think there's at least a dozen rapes. The men are, Total's gatehouse at this point is pretty rudimentary. It's a line of shipping containers pushed together in a wall with a hole in the middle and a barrier. The men are driven to the shipping containers and pushed into the two on either side. So kind of 125 in one, 125 in another. And they're kept there for 3 months. These are metal shipping containers, no windows, it's 30-degree heat, and they start suffocating. They're given minimal food and water. All the witnesses that I interviewed describe licking condensation off the ceiling to get some water. Some of them suffocate. When they're initially shoved in there, some of them are beaten to death. There are a few more beatings, but for whatever reason, the army decides that the attrition rate isn't fast enough, so they start taking people out and executing them, driving them away, saying that they're needed to go and help bury some rubbish. Anyway, whoever is taken away is never seen again. And of the 250 that go in, 26 come out, and they only survive actually because the Rwandans turn up and see what's going on. When they're taken back to their villages, the 26 survivors, they're threatened. They're told, don't talk about this, or there'll be reprisals. And the village headmen put out a kind of omerta saying, okay, nobody talks about this. So when people say, well, how come 200 people were executed like this and no one's talked about it? That's why, because they were threatened. And it took weeks of negotiation for me to talk to the people I spoke to. And then I stood up my survey group a second time and they went out and quantified how many people were killed. As I say, we think it's roughly 200, but we had names and ages and identities for 97. So that's where we are. Those are the facts.
If you don't have anything.
No, I would just say, I mean, the second massacre is, you know, I mean, they're both horrific. Obviously, the second one gets the first one. Total left. Total talks about having evacuated 1,250 people. Its own documents show it had 8,500 in Palma, so it left 7,500 people behind. That's its own workers. Never mind the 25,000 civilians who were at its gates. The liability on that there is a legal case on that now going in Paris. The liability on the second case is stronger. It happened on Total premises by a bunch of soldiers who were paid, accommodated, and equipped by Total and tasked with Total with defending its asset. I mean, it's incontestable. So it would be for lawyers to explore the sort of legal implications for that, but I think they're pretty heavy. And they certainly end up in criminal charges, and I would say there's financial implications for anyone who's lending to the project.
Thank you very much. I think we can switch with Clémence, who will speak about criminal responsibility, not only for Total but in general. I think especially for French companies. Clémence,
Yes, thank you. Yes.
you
Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So yes, I'll briefly talk to you today about where we are in terms of the attempts to engage criminal responsibility of companies in France before French courts for complicity in international crimes. First of all, to recall that, of course, criminal responsibility is not the only route or avenue available for victims or NGOs who would like to address the responsibility of companies. The civil liability there is also a possibility before French courts. And of course, this law on due diligence of companies, which is being used now more and more against companies to engage also their civil responsibility. But I would say that the criminal cases for complicity in international crimes in France have grown since around 10 years for a number of reasons. And first, a reason of principle, I would say, is that as a civil law country, the access for victims to the criminal route to trigger the opening of criminal investigations is easier before French courts than in common law jurisdictions, for example. So it is true that it is a way that is being explored growingly by victims, by NGOs, to engage the criminal responsibility of companies. Why choosing this route? I mean, there are a lot of different cases, a lot of methodologies used, and a lot of strategies also pursued by different actors. Again, victims, NGOs, local NGOs or international NGOs in these cases. But I would say that first and foremost, these complaints are filed when, of course, any attempt for dialogue has failed with the company itself. And also because we are talking about complicity in international crimes. So very often for victims themselves, it is the route for legal remedy, but also seen as a way to, of course, trigger the right for victims to truth and justice. When, in particular, we are in a situation of armed conflict in a given country, there is a greater vigilance that must be imposed on the companies itself because of the risk to be considered as an accomplice of international crimes that are committed in the framework of these conflicts. This may be war crimes, but also crimes against humanity. And so these companies are more exposed to the risk of having their criminal liability engaged when operating in a situation of conflict or maintaining their operations when a conflict arises. There is a growing tendency, I mean, this is not particular to the French context, internationally, globally, to engage the criminal responsibility or civil responsibility, I must say, of companies for complicity of international crimes. Because the question of the complicity is a growing concern for victims on the ground, victims of conflict, victims of war crimes or crimes against humanity. And you very often see in a situation of international crimes, may it be by a given regime or by non-state actors, the implication of companies in a very wide variety of ways, of course. The objective is also, of course, to create precedents and to influence the regulation of companies themselves and their rules of engagement when operating again in a situation of conflict. And this is a fact. I mean, the cases that move forward, the jurisprudence, serve indeed as a precedent and a way, a leverage for advocacy for a better regulation. I will give you one very concrete example. We started 10 years ago with FIDH and our member organizations in in the eve of the Arab Spring, a series of litigation targeting surveillance companies for complicity in the repression that was implemented by the regimes who felt threatened by these Arab Springs, so in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Syria, and elsewhere. There was no regulation at the time of this kind of technology, which allowed and which was sold to authoritarian regime back in the early 2000 and 2010 to surveil the electronic communication in real time of citizens of a given country, and thus allowing this repressive regime, of course, to enhance their methods of surveillance against human rights defenders, political opponents, etc. There was absolutely no regulation. This technology was not regulated at the international level. And starting these litigation with other actors, other NGOs, other partners, effectively contributed to this technology to be considered as a dual-use technology and included in the list of regulation of the dual-use technologies. This is one example among others, but of course these proceedings have a clear impact on the regulation when, again, the dialogue or the, I would say, more classical advocacy has failed. It is also very often a very concrete demand from victims who want to trigger mechanisms to get legal remedies, not only against the direct authors of the crimes, but also against the accomplices, including economic actors involved in these crimes. So I'll go back now to the situation in France. The French Parliament enacted the statute of the International Criminal Court in 2010. And so there is, since 2010, in French criminal legislation, definition of international crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes that are in accordance with the statute of the International Criminal Court. And on the other side, you have in France a general principle of criminal liability of the companies themselves, which is quite rare in jurisdictions. You often see, of course, the possibility to engage the criminal liability of heads of companies as individuals, I mean. But here in France, there is a general principle of liability of the companies themselves that can be indicted, to trial, and sentenced as legal entities. And this whole litigation around international crimes has rose since 2010, also with the creation in France and in other EU countries of specialized units for the prosecution of international crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, but also torture and enforced disappearances. This means that national courts have a greater ability with a specialization of judges, of prosecutors, of investigators to tackle the complexity of these crimes, including, of course, crimes that are committed abroad, that are committed in different cultural, political context, and also in situations where there is no access to the ground. So these units have developed techniques, methodologies, and improved their knowledge not only of the technicity of these crimes, but also of the methods of investigations that are required to investigate international crimes. And so this has been accompanied, of course, by a tendency of growth of this litigation. Again, not only engaging the responsibility of the direct perpetrators of these crimes, but also the companies as accomplices for the reasons that I have exposed. Today, there is a little bit less than a dozen cases that in France that are opened at different stages and that target companies, heads of companies, but also companies as legal entities for complicity in international crimes. It may concern a variety, as I was saying, of economic actors. It concerns a bank, French bank BNP, for its involvement in Sudan and Rwanda. It involves surveillance companies, as I was telling you. It also involves companies that have provided arms or component of arms serving in a given armed conflict, or the very well-known case of Lafarge, who maintained its activities in northern Syria despite the control of the territory by ISIS. So all of these cases, again, are at very different stages. There has not been a trial so far, so we don't have a precedent as a conviction in France, but we do have a very important decision that was handed down in 2021 by the Supreme Court, the Cour de Cassation, which upheld the indictment of Lafarge for complicity in crimes against humanity in Syria. And this was a precedent-set decision because it led I would say, the conditions under which a company can be considered as an accomplice to international crimes. There was a legal argument between the defense, also the prosecutor, and the civil parties, victims, NGOs, acting as civil parties in this case, around the nature of the consent that must be given. Lafarge and the prosecutor actually were claiming that in order to be held accomplice or criminally responsible as an accomplice, it has to be proven that a company shared the intent to commit the international crimes, may it be crimes against humanity or war crimes. And in this ruling, the Supreme Court considered that it is not necessary to prove that the company as an accomplice has to share the intent to commit the crimes, but that it has to provide some kind of assistance to the commission of the crimes, knowing that the crimes are being perpetrated or under preparation. And this was really key as a jurisprudence, as a precedent set, because of course the intent of the companies is the economic viability of their activity most often, and it would have been impossible to prove that they were sharing the intent to commit the international crime. So this jurisprudence really opens the way to engage the criminal liability of company as accomplices, because the threshold that was fixed by the Supreme Court corresponds, I would say, to the reality of the nature of the engagement of the companies in these international crimes, especially in situation of conflicts. So this was really a groundbreaking precedent, I would say. Again, there are no trials yet, but they are multiplication, as I said, of the cases that are targeting companies that have been indicted by the French specialized unit, and investigations that are underway and that incarnate a stronger, I would say, legal risk for companies to be considered liable for complicity in international crimes than 10 years ago. And this corresponds to a general tendency of attempts in favor of accountability, I mean, for international crimes in a general way. I'll stop there, and I'm available for any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clémence. So maybe we can switch to Katie, and if you just can take 5 minutes, and we will take question after that. Katie, could you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you. Well, I'm going to talk about what is happening on the ground. The reality is that since 2019, TotalEnergie started to make the resettlement process, where at least 556 families have been planned to be resettled, but now the number is higher. We have more than 600 families resettled in Kitunda village. And all those families, the most number of these families, they are living in a situation of uncertainty because they are still waiting for the company to finalize the process of compensations and also to give them the lands for them to produce food. We normally call it mashambas here. And those communities didn't receive yet their lands to produce food. And they also lost their access to sea. We are talking about agriculture and fishery communities who lost their access to the sea. And uncertainties because the process of compensation is really complex, and the company is still trying to find out lands to give to the resettlers in Kitunda. That's why they are negotiating lands with other communities as Makala, Maganja, and Monjani communities who are were not directly affected by the project, but because they need land to provide to the resettlers, they started to negotiate with these communities, but they didn't compensate it yet those communities, which means that when they started to give the land to the resettlers, it started to create a conflict between the communities, because people are not allowing the resettlers to use their land because they didn't receive the compensation that has been agreed by the project. And because of this, there is a community called Makala, which since 2018, they started to negotiate with the project to give their lands to the resettlers. And all this time, only the last year they signed agreements. And when the communities signed agreements, it means that they cannot use the land anymore, meaning that agricultural communities cannot produce their food because they are not allowed, because they already signed an agreement. But the project didn't compensate them, meaning that since the last year, October last year, Makala, they signed agreements, they delivered their lands, but they didn't receive compensations, and the communities from Kitunda are not allowed to use the lands. That's why they protest in the beginning of this month of November. They started to protest at the company's gates of Total, in a crossroads called the Cuatro Caminos, not allowing the project to proceed with their activities. They were saying that if we are stopping our activities, if we cannot produce food in our mashambas, it means that Total also cannot do their activities. And now what is happening is that they, after 1 year and some months that community could not produce food because they were waiting for compensation from the project, they are negotiating with the communities to compensate, but they also say that they don't need those lands anymore, which create more uncertainty, because now the communities in Kitunda are asking, so what about us? If you don't need anymore these lands in Makala, which lands are we going to produce our food? Where are we going to have our mashambas? And apart of that, there is a lot of fishermen that are also waiting to receive their compensation. But we are talking about thousands and thousands of families who are waiting to receive these compensations, to sign agreements. But they also, in the specific case of the fishermen, they have been assigned a new area to go to fish. But what is happening there is that there is a military, how can I call it? It's a military center where they are not allowed to go to fish more to the right side because there are some infrastructures of the company. But this is the area they say that the fishermen could go, but they are not allowed to make their activity freely. That's why they prefer to find other alternatives, meaning that they have to walk hundreds of kilometers to arrive in better places where they feel free to develop their activities. And all this situation is making that the communities, they don't trust anymore the company, because even now with these negotiations of the protesters in Makala, they are making some promises, but the community, they don't believe anymore what the company say, because they sometimes say something and then they change their mind. They say that we will compensate you, and at that time they will say no, we won't compensate because we won't need this land anymore. And in all this time, everybody knows that the force majeure is there, but even the force majeure is not, they didn't lift the force majeure, but their activities of the process of resettlement and compensations and other activities of constructions, they are being developed. So the communities, they don't trust anymore, because this behavior of saying something and change cannot be trustful. And on the other hand, we also have the situation of the militarization in the area. You can see that the last month I've been in Palma, and the communities, they live under a constant climate of terror, because at any time they feel, they are afraid that an attack could happen. And what you could see at the 8th of October, 26th of September, and a rumor appeared saying that a beheaded body appeared in a farmland near to the village, and everybody started to pack and run. But and everybody was saying that it's safe for us to go to Kitunda, because Kitunda village is nearby the campsite of Total, where the protection is higher, where the guarantee that we could survive is in that site. So even when you're in Palma, you can see the Rwandese troops. They have specific points to protect the Musimba village, Palma village, and the Afungi Peninsula, where the interests of the gas industry are. So you can even see escorts from the Rwandese troops escorting the fuel that is going to the campsite. But the same is not happened to the food and fuel getting in the Palma village. And also in the meetings that the company have with the communities, because they want to feel safe, they want to circulate and feel safe in the communities, they go with the escorts of militaries, which is also something that doesn't confer security from the communities. They don't feel comfortable in these meetings. And even for us as civil society, when we go to Palma now, we many times have to be interviewed by militaries, telling who we are, where are we going, what we are going to do. And they started to say that we have to ask permission at the administration to go to specific places, to the houses of communities, which for us it's not a good manner of acting. And we also have the situation of young people that doesn't have access to employment.
1 minute left, if possible, as we would like to have time for questions. If it's possible to just.
Yes.
In 1 minute.
Yes, I'm finalizing. Just to say that at the environmental level, we also have the problem of the erosion of the lands in the communities of Senga, Monjani, and other, because the projects, they had made soil removal to borrowed land to their construction, which means that the community now have the erosions in the land, and which doesn't confer security. It's not safe for them to circulate in cars because the erosion is higher in that area. Yes, I would like to share much more with you, but because of time, anyway, I'm still here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So sorry to interrupt you. It's I know that it could be much more longer, but unfortunately we have only 1 hour. So do you have a question? Yeah.
Yes, I have one. You don't see me, Mathieu Fermurier, journalist. I've got a question for Clémence. You said that you may plan to go at the criminal court. If yes, what about the extraterritoriality of the French law? We know that with the Lafarge case for the Syrian people, due to this lack of extraterritoriality, there was a dismissal. On the civil court, with the devoir de vigilance, what about the French case La Poste? And because when you read the note d'orientation, you see that the judge talk about an obligation of mean, but also underlying an obligation of result. Do you see this nuance? And is it possible to have two cases on the same cases, one on the criminal and one on the civil court? And what will be the addition of the current trial with the 2021 attack?
And what will be what? Sorry, I didn't get the last part of the question.
Will it be new cases or just an add-on of the 2021 attack trial that is already open?
On Lafarge, you mean?
No, on TotalEnergie. On the Palma attack, because there is
okay.
a trial open.
Okay, yeah. So first of all, there are different grounds of jurisdictions that can be used in these cases and that have been used in these cases against companies, these criminal cases. So you have universal jurisdiction, which has a very strong extraterritorial component that has been used as a basis to initiate some of these cases. You also have another basis, which is active personality jurisdiction, which means that it is the French nationality of these companies that have been used, and that as such has also an extraterritorial component, meaning that these two bases for jurisdiction, universal jurisdiction or active personality jurisdiction, allow the courts to investigate crimes that are committed abroad and to consider criminal sanctions. The last criteria for jurisdiction, which has also been used, so jointly in some cases or alternatively, is the territorial jurisdiction, because it can be considered that some acts of complicity are done on French territory, meaning when you have companies that have their headquarters in France and that you are able to prove that some decisions are made on the French territory within these headquarters, then there is a territorial component also that gives jurisdiction to French courts. So it is a combination in some cases again, or either way of these criteria as basis for jurisdiction that have been used in all of the cases so far. And so there is, again, an extraterritorial component that is important. In the case of Lafarge, the part that was dismissed for the Syrian salaries is about a felony and not a crime. It was ruled by rule of legislation that depends on the nature also of these felony. But for the crimes themselves, I mean, when we're talking about the complicity of crimes against humanity or war crimes, there is an extraterritorial component to the jurisdiction of French courts. Now, the due diligence law, is, I would say, under construction. There has been a lot of cases, a lot of attempts, a lot of rulings, some of them including in cases initiated by FIDH, in one case actually, where the I would say conservative approach of the judges to the way to interpret the law on the due diligence was criticized. So there is a lot of awareness and vigilance from civil society, from the NGOs involved in this kind of litigation, to see how the jurisprudence will evolve and how this law will be interpreted effectively in a conservative manner or in a more progressive manner that, according to us as civil society, of course, is more in accordance with the idea of this law and the reasons why it was adopted. Now, there is two claims that can be done on the due diligence French law. One is really to ask a judge to order a company to modify its vigilance plan for the future, to take in accordance risks that have not been taken into account by the company. So you see that it is an effect for the future again. And you have also a component that may include the civil liability of the company and the fact of compensating the victims. So it is a very different output, right, than the criminal avenue. And in its civil component, the compensation, then it could deprive victims. Victims could not ask compensation from a criminal proceedings if they already asked for compensation through the mechanism of civil responsibility or the law of due diligence. But these are supposed to be also complementary mechanisms, of course, that do not have the same purpose and the same objective. It is a different thing to ask a criminal judge to enter into sanctions against a company, criminal sanctions, and to ask a judge to order a company to change its behavior in the future. So, different objectives and different philosophy behind the nature of these actions.
Thank you.
There was a question online. Is there a question?
Well, I have one for Clémence.
Okay,
Yeah.
you can, of course.
Clémence, given what I sort of outlined about these two different attacks, how would you see cases proceeding, if any?
Well, it's very difficult to do a case study now on, on the case or to provide a legal opinion in in a couple of minutes. But I mean, what you have presented is I would say, the typical way that a case starts, a criminal case starts, right? You have investigations on the ground, very thorough investigations. You have direct testimonies. A company's activities that were maintained in the conflict and its involvement also potentially in these crimes. So I would say that it is typically the kind of investigations that start criminal cases before French courts. I would not go beyond that today because you understand that, again, it's difficult for me to provide to go further. But again, I would say that this is exactly how all of the cases I know about, at least, have started.
I've got another question because Le Monde just published another article releasing proof that Total may be aware of human rights abuses, but not mentioning what you describe in your article. Are you aware of any? Is it because it's an important piece what is described in the newspaper Le Monde for criminal charges? Is it this type of pieces that you may seek? Any proof of the company being aware?
It's a question for me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, no, so I haven't read the article of Le Monde, actually. I've seen it, but I haven't read it yet. But yeah, of course, there's many ways to prove the knowledge of a company. You may have access to records, again, of, notes of meetings and or insiders that, in previous cases, we've had whistleblowers from the companies testifying and asserting that there was some knowledge of the company and that despite the knowledge, either the company continued to operate or continued to behave in the same way. Yeah, there's a lot of ways, but of course, proving knowledge is critical in a case, but you don't have to prove the knowledge at the stage of a complaint. I mean, this is something also for the judges. And this is also why this criminal route is often used in France, because you're handing out a case that does not need to be a prima facie case, that does not need to bring all the evidence, right? But you're asking and saying that there is enough to start a criminal investigation and to ask the judges to investigate, to do searches in the companies that, of course, NGOs or journalists doesn't have the mean to do. So it's also giving, I would say, information and asking judges to seek for evidence.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that as well. Like the documents you're referring to are they're obtained under an FOI application by TotalEnergie.
Freedom of information.
Freedom of information. It's actually just one piece of the evidence that shows Total knew that. I mean, in the Rufan report, he's talking about how your relationship with the Mozambican army is extremely problematic. They're well known to commit human rights abuses, and by paying and accommodating them and asking them to defend you, his exact words are, you have become a party to the conflict, as in you've taken sides in this war. But beyond that, I mean, there's countless NGO investigations on human rights abuses by this army. I mean, the CIA, hardly a human rights defender, has described them as an army sort of prone to using torture. In fact, the US Embassy did an assessment of Mozambique for the next 10 years and said something to the effect like the army doesn't qualify as an army because it doesn't perform any of the normal functions of an army. It's more of a criminal organization. So the idea, as I say, that Total wouldn't know who it was doing business with is absurd. Everybody knows what the army is in Mozambique, and it's not really an army.
Just to give an example, we have rape cases from the army in a control post between Palma and the project area in Mozambique courts. We have the Mozambique Human Rights Commissions with cases of the army kidnapping individuals, asking for a ransom from compensation, people that receive compensation. So there's a body of work showing this history and this way of human rights, and you paying them, and they're there for you, and militarization is to protect you. So there is quite a decent amount. How that legally works out is, I'm not an expert.
The impunity is such that the army puts this stuff on social media. There are videos on social media of the army executing people. There is no secret.
There is a question online. I don't know if you have time. Is it more for Clémence again? It's from Viviane de Beaufort. I don't know if you can open your micro, Viviane. Whether I could read it. Okay, I will read it. So, do you think that the CSDDD could provide an opening on the accountability of companies in the case of conflict zones by requiring more prevention of this risk of a geopolitical nature?
Of course, this is again the whole logic and the whole philosophy of these instruments is to trigger obligations for the companies to have a greater duty of identifying the risks and putting in place measures to prevent these risks and to measure these risks. And in last situation, to prevent from, because again, the fact that companies are operating in a situation of conflict de facto enhances the risk of criminal liability and of participating in a way or another to human rights violations or to international crimes. So given this situation, yes, there needs to be a stronger realization from companies that the risk is enhanced and that it requires a very stronger identifying of the risk and clear measures that are adopted in a transparent way to establish and implement measures to mitigate these risks.
Thank you.
I think we will see what could happen with the CSDDD, but okay. When again, there is really a problem about the way we could approach the responsibility of the head of the group. It is very difficult, depending on if there is a question in France, as in the affaire La Poste, or elsewhere in conflict areas.
Okay, I think we can keep on to discuss by maybe we can follow the conversation by email, or you can write, of course, to French CIF or FIDH, I think, directly. We will maybe stop here if everyone is okay, because we have 30 minutes. We should stop at 6 p.m. So thank you to everyone. Thank you. A big thanks to Daniel, Alex, Antoine, Clémence, and Katie for your time, your testimonies, and do not hesitate to send some other question to French CIF for our speaker. Then relay question if you have. And thanks to everyone again.